All right, today we're going to be talking about DOM-based vulnerabilities, and we're not going to go into too much detail today just because of how wide-ranging these tend to be, but we'll kind of touch the surface on all of it and try to give you a good idea of what you might be seeing. So first, let's talk about what the DOM is. We talked about this briefly when we went over cross-site scripting, but I'll go over it again. The document object model is the browser's representation of elements that will appear on the web page. So this image is a pretty good explanation of what that might look like. And, sometimes websites will use JavaScript to manipulate nodes and objects in the DOM. And if attacker controlled value is, passed from a source into a sink, which we'll talk about in a second, that's when you might find a vulnerability. So a source is any JavaScript property that accepts data that is potentially controlled by users. So an example of this would be like location.search, because it reads user data from a string and it's really easy for us to manipulate. A sink is a little bit different, and those are potentially dangerous JavaScript functions or DOM objects that let us pass user-controlled data into it. So like the eval function or the document write property would be good examples of this. So a source is where the data comes from, but if the data from that source is passed into a sink, that's being executed, that would be what leads to a vulnerability. And typically these are cross-site scripting type vulnerabilities. So the example that we've got here is the source is this window.location.search query. So if you input your search term, it gets passed into this query value, that creates this query variable. Then that gets passed over to a sink that writes data to the document object model, which would allow you to execute cross-site scripting by just including a payload in the right spot in your search term. So, we talked about this in the cross-site scripting video, but it's basically just a step deeper on how we would understand it. And here's, just a brief little example of what this might be. So let's say, why is this unsafe? Well, it's because location.hash.slice, this is just in a URL if you have the pound or hashtag like character. That's what this is referencing. Anything after that, if you leave it blank, it's just going to be the default URL. Otherwise, it's going to be whatever it is. And it's making this goto variable point to anything there. And if goto starts with HTTPS, it will set our location to that, which is just a redirect. So we could exploit this by just having that character there and then sending them to our malicious domain so long as it's using HTTPS, right? Because that's the condition they set for us. You could see immediately why this might be bad, right? Because if you have a company and you've got your company website, I could make a really good phishing link with this because it could have your company's domain here if you're vulnerable, but it would actually redirect all your users to my malicious page. So open redirection or malicious redirection is just one of the many things that we could do with some of these DOM-based vulnerabilities. And because of, as you probably saw in that example, these are pretty wide-reaching in what you could do and how you would actually go about exploiting it. So, these are the common sources you might find that lead to these things. Like we just saw location as the source being referenced, but any of these locations could be considered, potentially vulnerable. And there's tons of different sinks that your sources could pass this data to that could be vulnerable. So you could see open redirect vulnerabilities, cross-site scripting. You could use you could manipulate your cookie that's passed through, you could manipulate your document.cookie, and then that would allow you to maybe impersonate somebody else or even get somebody else's cookies. File path traversal. There's tons of different things you can do with these kind of DOM-based vulnerabilities, which is why I'm kind of like leaving a good chunk of them just out because of how wide-reaching they are, and we would just be kind of talking about the same thing with slightly different applications. One thing I did find really interesting about this topic, though, is DOM clobbering attacks. So these allow you to inject HTML into a page, and it's useful where cross-site scripting isn't possible, but where we're still allowed to control something on the page, like an ID or a name that's whitelisted by some HTML filter. The most common form of this is when we use an anchor element to overwrite a global variable, which is then used by the application in some unsafe way, like if it generates a dynamic URL or something like that. It refers to the idea that we're clobbering that global variable and overwriting it with a DOM node or some HTML collection. So I'll show you a quick example of what that might look like. So let's say that we have a website that allows you to comment on people's blog posts. And if you don't have an account, it uses this default avatar image next to that comment. So people know that it's, that it's a new account or whatever, just so that there's an image there to be used. And the problem is, right, this uses let default avatar be default avatar, or avatar, this, what would you call it? This property, is referencing this image. And the big issue here is that it's using this or operator, which is most of the reason that you can do DOM clobbering. So you'd have to look into the JavaScript, find this line, and then use that to construct your attack. So if you're able to edit some HTML on the page, or if you're able to, manipulate some ID variable, you would be able to do this. So first, you would make two anchors with the same ID, like default avatar. We're making these two anchors. And the second one is for the point of making this name attribute in the second anchor. So anchor ID, we make this name attribute that clobbers the avatar property, and it contains this cross-site scripting payload. And this has a bunch of extra characters. These are just designed to evade a filter. You could put whatever cross-site scripting in here because it's just using href as an attribute. So in this case, when you load the blog that has this comment on it, instead of loading the default avatar, it would trigger a alert window to pop up in your browser. So that's an example of how you might see that play out when it gets exported in the wild, or when you're doing your CCFs or whatever. So the thing about prevention for at least DOM clobbering, you want to have checks that objects and functions are what you expect them to be. And you also want to avoid writing code that references global variables with the or operator, because that's most of the reason why we can do these kind of things. And then, because of how wide-reaching these things are, there's no fix everything task you can do. There's general guidance, but try to really just avoid letting, the data coming from those sources to alter or be transmitted to sinks in a way that is insecure. So if you have a sink that is doing something sensitive, try to make sure that that data that's being passed into your sources is properly being, if it's untrusted data, make sure that it's being cleaned up. And if it's trusted data, make sure there's no way that an attacker could influence it. But that's all we got for today. Pretty short one. I'll catch you in the next video.